We made this.
Welcome to the Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and welcoming a new guest to this show, but he's been a guest a few times on my other show, and that's Derick McDuff. Derick, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on. I see you're definitely representing with the Japanese shirt on.
Yeah. I didn't even remember I was wearing this, and then I came on the podcast and said, "Oh, this is perfect," because it was a Christmas present I got from my parents, but it came like defective, so I got a new one, and I was just at my parents' house watching the Super Bowl, and I threw it on, and I was like, "Oh wait, this is perfect." Yeah. I'm on the Japan podcast, so this worked out.
That works out nicely, yeah.
Yeah.
So what I like to do, especially with new guests, is to have you tell a little bit about yourself to the audience.
Yeah, so I am a host of another film podcast called Underrated, where we talk about underrated films or underappreciated ones. So we haven't talked about, I was going to say we haven't talked about any Japanese stuff, but that's not true. We had talked about Perfect Blue, which is a great movie.
Amazing movie, yeah.
But yeah, it's good to talk about underrated stuff. I have a couple other podcast things I do, including one that you've been on called Infinity Stones and Dragon Bones, where I talk about the MCU. I'm also a freelance writer working for places like Watch Mojo, but yeah.
Great. So let's talk about your interest in Japanese movies, right? You said you've talked about Perfect Blue. I think originally when you emailed me about coming on, you'd actually wanted to talk about anime. So my guess is kind of your introduction to Japanese film comes from the world of anime, right?
Yeah, and I think like a lot of, people, my generation, I was introduced to Japanese cinema through animation. And, especially I'm a really big fan of the Ghibli films and Miyazaki in particular. I've watched all of his films. But the Japanese live action stuff, which obviously had greatly influenced a lot of that, has been a big blind spot for me. I hadn't watched anything by Kurosawa until this last year. I finally got around to watching stuff, so I'm actually really excited to be filling in more of the live action blind. Like I haven't seen any O's or anything like that, so I'm excited to try and fill in some of those gaps.
Awesome. Kurosawa was a big starting point for a lot of people who are starting to get into live action Japanese movies. I'm pretty sure that was my first start as well with Seven Samurai, because that was a movie that talked about endlessly, so everybody talks about it, and with good reason too. So that's why that tends to be like most people's go-to as a starting movie. Which is kind of funny though, because when I talk to my students here in Japan, and when I talk to them about Kurosawa, a lot of them, they have no idea who I'm talking about. Or maybe they've heard his name, but they've actually never seen any of his movies.
Interesting. And then I have seen some like J-horror stuff, So like I think early on we did cover something on the pod. I can't even remember what, it was so long ago. It was like the really early days of the podcast. But I have seen some of that stuff because, I'm not a huge horror guy, but I have friends who are really big horror people. But through osmosis, I've seen some of that stuff. But yeah, I definitely need to get more into the other genres of live action filmmaking. And it's interesting to hear that Kurosawa is and I think that's something that we a lot of times do in the West, is like take somebody and it kind of plays into the auteur filmmaking, which is very popular here, but I'm not sure how popular it would be in Japan, which is, I'm not a huge fan of the auteur theory, but just like lift this person up and like, oh yeah, they're this great master, so obviously they must be famous everywhere. And yeah, to hear that's not necessarily the case is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, Japan has a much more there's a much more like a craftsmanship like feel to a lot of the directing. The directors here are much more like working directors, right? They have to crank out several movies, and I've used this example probably every episode this season, but it's a good one because I used this example in class recently when I was talking about comparing Quentin Tarantino to Takashi Miike. both guys started out in like the same rough time period, right? Both of them making starting off was kind of like these, low budget gangster films, right? That's how both of them
Mhm.
kind of got their start. And both of them went on to do bigger and better things, earning international acclaim. So lots of parallels between them. But, they both started out like, early 90s, and Tarantino has made what, 10 films or something like that?
Yeah, I think like 9 or 10, because I think he said
Nine
he
or
was going
10,
to
something.
stop at 10, but he's counting Kill Bill, both of them as one film. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. So in that same time frame, Takashi Miike has made like if he hasn't made 200 films yet, he's very close to 200 films. So there's a very
Yeah.
different type of attitude towards it. And he's not he's a bit of an outlier, but not by much. A lot of these directors, they have, if you look up their filmographies, they've got a massive list of credits to their name. And not only
Mhm.
film, but also doing TV work and stuff like that. So it's not like where, Tarantino or Steven Spielberg or James Cameron will come out, they'll make a movie, and then it's like 10 years you don't hear anything from them.
Yeah, that is very interesting to hear. And I just speaking of Takeshi Miike, is it Miike? I never know how to pronounce his name.
Takashi Miike.
Okay, yeah. So I've only seen a couple of his films, but I do think this is kind of unrelated, but I do think he's made one of the best ever video game adaptations with his version of Ace Attorney, which I'm a really big fan of.
He also made the film version of Yakuza Like a Dragon.
Okay, I need to see that one then.
That's it. It's not bad. It for a video game
Hmm.
adaptation, it's pretty decent. But
Hmm.
as a Miike film, it was a little bit disappointing because I have kind of a
Okay.
higher bar of expectations for him.
Right. Right. Okay. Fascinating.
But yeah, he's broken out and he's done a lot of those more uh doing a lot more adaptation stuff. Like he did the adaptation of the Crows manga.
Hmm.
He a few other ones too. I think oh, Blade of the Immortal, I think that was him. I think he did that one and a bunch of
Okay.
other ones too.
Okay. That's really cool. That's really cool.
So which Kurosawa movies have you seen so far then? What are the ones, obviously the one we're talking about today is Kagemusha, but what are some of the other ones that you've seen?
So the only one I'd seen, and I was something where I was like, all right, I'm gonna watch the first, I'm gonna watch one, and I kind of like asked like film Reddit, like, what do you think I should watch? And I got like a bunch of answers, and it was a lot of the big ones like your Seven Samurais and stuff like that. And which I've seen the remake of Samurai, because
Oh,
I've seen.
the more recent Magnificent Seven.
Yeah, exactly. The one with Ethan Hawke and all those guys. I've seen that, and I
Right.
have that's. But I decided to go with Hidden Fortress for the first one I watched, because I was like, I know that this is so influential in Star Wars, and I was like really curious to see that and to see how that all played out and to kind of have a baseline to compare it to. And you can clearly see the influences that it had on Star Wars. But
Hmm.
since then, this is the first one that I'd seen by him, and I was very excited to kind of talk to look at it and talk about it, because he is a filmmaker. Like I said, I don't know very well, and I'd only ever seen the one other film of his.
Okay, so that's interesting because we're coming at this from two different perspectives. Because I've got more of a perspective of more of his earlier films, like Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, uh, blanking on the other, Throne of Blood. That was the one I was thinking. The
Hmm.
adaptation of Macbeth. So what did you think watching this?
I was very impressed by it. One thing that really struck me is that, going into this, you hear so much about his silent films, and obviously, or not his silent films, his black and white films,
Black and white,
and
yeah.
obviously, yeah, he was making films in that black and white because that was the technology that was available through so much of his career. But I think maybe other than Ran, he all his films that are the more kind of famous, at least to Westerners, are his earlier black and white films. And to see
Hmm.
this film in color, in such vivid, incredible color, really struck me. It was like, wow, this. It felt like this master has a new tool to use. He's
Hmm.
only been able to work in different shades of gray in the past, and now getting to play with all of these colors. That battle scene in particular, where it's just like the flashing lights, and you see the blue and the red just kind of flashing, or all the different colors of all the samurai uniforms or the armors,
Hmm.
and even that dream sequence. It was so vivid. It was one of the most amazing like just visual films I've ever seen.
Mhm.
I was also like, it did feel like a real epic. I am a big fan of, and that's why I wanted to pick this one in particular. I love historical epics. I love
Mhm.
big war films. And this was definitely that. It had these big sequences that were like, thousands of samurai fighting each other, and it is set in this interesting time period where, you have swords, but you also have guns, and the world is kind of changing, and you know all that stuff. But it's also a very personal film. It is a story about one guy, and it is all these interesting different layers about identity, and me being someone who has been an actor in the past, that
Mhm.
that kind of thing is like, where do you stop and the person you're playing begins. And it really reminded me of a lot of like biopics, which are really popular. And I think that the reason biopics are really popular with Academy voters are because it's easier to look at someone and be like, wow, this person is doing a good impression, than just kind of like, what is an objective good performance. And
Mhm.
to see him kind of like slip into the role of this other person, and him kind of having to adapt to it, and the relationship that he had with the grandkid, and how his psychology kind of changed over the course of the film, and not necessarily for the better. I
Mhm.
thought all of that was very fascinating. I love when films have a such a large scope, but are still so personal at the same time.
Mhm. So I had a much different reaction to you. There's some things there I agree with. I do think the color looks amazing. Like visually, the film is very beautiful, and it is interesting to see Kurosawa get to play with color in this way. There's some scenes like the one that stood out to me surprisingly, because it's a very otherwise very quiet scene, and is when um Shingen is sitting in his room, and he's talking to one of his visors, and then two of the retainers, they come in and the doors open, and it's just like it looks like a painting. It's just like this, the
Hmm.
colors in the scene are very vibrant, and just like the way it's framed and everything, it's just a very beautiful use of color, of and just a very great way of blocking out that scene, I thought. And there's a lot of stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff in this that looks really good. But as far as the actual movie itself, when I'm thinking about it as a whole, I was actually kind of disappointed in it. I feel like it went on. Feel like it was too long, and I didn't feel as much of a connection with this character, or I didn't feel as connected with the story as I did with like Seven Samurai or Yojimbo or any of his other films. And it's and I was struggling to think about what it is, and I just feel like there just wasn't that same effort. Like you watch Seven Samurai, and that film is also like 3 hours. I think it's 3 hours and change actually,
Mm.
but it's like Avengers Endgame. It's a brisk 3 hours. It moves very quickly from scene to scene. This one's a lot more slow, a lot more ponderous, and it was a lot more difficult to get into it, especially because in the beginning, for most of the movie, we don't see any action on screen. Like we're told about everything that happens. So
Mhm.
that was definitely a choice. I'm not quite sure I agree with that choice. I'm not quite sure it was a good choice, but it was a definite choice that was made. And I just found that curious because, and I'm not sure what the, I know, I'm not sure 100% about the backstory of this film. I do know that at the time it was the most expensive Japanese film ever made. Um, they had Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas actually help put up some of the funding for it. So I'm not sure if maybe he had saved all of his budget or had already used all of his budget on the big action scenes, and then he had to just kind of like work with what he had left for these other scenes. But it it was a curious choice, I felt.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see what you're saying, because it wasn't what I was expecting. I was expecting more of like a big, you know, historical, just kind of like a Zulu or something, where it's just like you're just getting these huge battle sequences, and that's all of the movie. And I think that there's certainly there in parts, but like you were saying, it is very long and drawn out, and is much more about these conversations that people are having about what is going on. And it honestly reminded me a lot of Lawrence of Arabia in that
Hmm.
respect, where it is just kind of this grand sweeping epic and people are giving speeches, and it is, in the same way that Lawrence kind of gets hyped up on the idea of himself as like this great hero and everything. I think that, in this one, the double starts to believe that he is not like literally, but he starts to kind of believe that in his own mythos of him being the actual guy, to the point where that's what causes it to all fall apart for him. Is like, oh, no one can ride that horse except for the original. And when
Mm-hmm.
he with his hubris, like he's like, oh, I've become him. I am just like him. I can totally ride this horse. And obviously that doesn't work out, and it all falls apart for him. So in that way, it reminded me a lot of like a big, kind of sweeping epic that you would see in, Britain or in the Americas, maybe like 20 years before this, and certainly not something like you would get to see today, because I do think the epic has really died out, and that's why I was excited and wanted to talk about this one rather than something that would be more like of a just kind of like contemporary at the time it was released crime story, something like
Mm-hmm.
that. Because I do like I one thing I do appreciate, other than like the colors and everything, was just that goes with the look of it, was just this look of just kind of this feudal Japan that I thought
Mm-hmm.
was very cool. And as far as I could tell, you would know obviously more than me, but like it seemed very authentic and real. And there was definitely some times, though, like you were saying, where I do felt like it was a little bit slow. It was a little bit kind of drawn out. Uh, I don't know. I saw the original cut. I only saw the 2 hour and 30 minute cut. I know there is a 3 hour cut. Do you know? Did you see the 3 hour or the 2 hour one, or 2.5 hour one?
I've got the 3 hour cut. That's the one I have. That's the Criterion one, I believe. So, and that's the one.
Yeah,
That's the
yeah.
one I own. Yeah.
So yeah, I wonder. Like, I think maybe if I think that might be part of the difference too. Is, and I usually am someone who likes a longer cut, but I do think sometimes it's like, yeah, there are some things that are taken out of the movie that, for good reason, things that slow down the film. So I think honestly it probably did benefit, and I think it was mostly him. I don't think it was like studio notes or anything. As far as I can tell, the stuff that he cut out seemed to be him being like, okay, we need to improve the pacing of this movie and cut it down from that kind of more bloated 3 hours to still a long, but a more kind of evenly paced 2.5.
Yeah, because we were getting towards the end, and I knew kind of like the basic structure of this story, so I
Mhm.
knew that we were getting towards the end, and it felt like I'm like we got a lot of movie left when we're right at the end here. So I think you're right. I think maybe he did cut it down for pacing, which I maybe I would have enjoyed it more if I had watched that version instead. But one of the things you said in there when you're talking about the sweeping epic and the idea of trying to you know, live up to this legend and kind of like buying into this myth that he is that the double is basically Shingen now. Um, there's some interesting things in that, and it brought to mind because at the time we're recording this, just as I was telling you off mic yesterday, the episode when you came on to my show talk about Batman Begins came out. And after I'd listened to that episode, I kind of want to go back and listen to the other Nolan episode I had done with Will Short talking about The Dark Knight Rises. And I was thinking about the fact that one of the things I had said on both of those episodes, and one of the things I still believe, is that I felt like Christopher Nolan kind of started to buy into his own hype after Inception. And
Mhm.
it felt like he was starting to believe his biggest fans when they're talking about like, oh, Christopher Nolan can do no wrong. He's the greatest filmmaker. I get the feeling that some of that went to his head and it's kind of affected his directing style. And I say this about Christopher Nolan, and I'm not saying that Kurosawa had the same thing. I'm not saying that I felt like he started to buy into his own hype, but I think that idea may have been on his mind because he had gone through some troubling stuff in the 1970s. The 70s was a really the 60s to the 70s was a really difficult time for him. Like um, his contract with Toho came to an end at 1966, and he felt that the domestic film industry in Japan was really kind of troubled, and he was interested in going to America and starting to work in Hollywood. So he had there was a project he was going to be on called Runaway Train, but that ended up getting
I've heard of this. Yeah.
and eventually it didn't actually work out. But then he ended up becoming involved in Tora Tora Tora, which was, portrayal of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, both from the American and the Japanese points of view. Kurosawa was going to handle the Japanese side of things, but there was he was only on it for like 3 weeks, right? The was unfamiliar to him. The requirements were very different from what he had come to expect. The American producers, were really puzzled by the way he worked, and they thought he was mentally ill, and they actually had him examined. That he had, and he had some, and then he eventually left from. He eventually got fired and was replaced by Kinji Fukasaku and Toshio Masuda, and the movie was just completely panned, and it was such a debacle that he felt he was worried that he wasn't becoming viable. And I think because he had started to get all this acclaim in the 60s, so I think he was maybe at that risk of buying into his own hype and thinking like, well, why do I have to deal with the Japanese film industry with all its problems? I could just go to America because everybody in America loves me now. So I think this might kind of be like maybe a reflection on that aspect of it, right? Him trying to think like, just like the Shadow Warrior trying to fit into, trying too hard to live into Shingen's mold and then getting, thrown off the horse literally as a result, and then getting cast out and becoming obsessed with that idea so much so that it ends in his death. I wonder if Kurosawa was maybe worried about something similar happening to him, or maybe he was reflecting on, maybe he was at risk of that happening at some point.
Yeah, honestly, I think that's a really interesting take, and because we touched on briefly the auteur theory and how I'm really not a fan of that, and I do think that is something like you talked about Nolan and directors buying into their own hype, and I think a lot of times it is the result of this auteur theory, which if anybody is listening and they're kind of unfamiliar, just basically the broad strokes are it's like, okay, there is one author, quote unquote, of the film, and it's all, like there you can see their vision and you can see over the course of the years their works, despite the fact that hundreds and thousands of people, unless it's something like Primer, work on a film, and it's the result of all of these different people, writers, directors, cinematographers, and of course directors. And it's not just the director who does it, but I think that is something that was popularized with a lot of French filmmakers and French film critics, and then applied to a lot of particularly Americans, and then I guess in this case Japanese filmmakers. And yeah, this feels like, at first I was like, oh, this is a movie about like being an actor, but I think that, yeah, you have a point. This could be definitely read as a movie about being a director and having to deal with that auteur theory and the kind of imposter syndrome that might come with it, because I think that is the imposter syndrome thing is a huge thing in this movie. And it's kind of the driving force behind this character. And it's something that I read William Goldman's book a while back, and he talked about how he thinks that's what happened with oh my gosh, why am I spacing? Is the most famous director of all, Alfred Hitchcock. And like he was, he made Psycho, he made all these great films, and then people were like, oh, Alfred Hitchcock he's this auteur, he's amazing. And then his like last few films were just not that great and according to Goldman. And it's because he bought into the hype of, him being this great legendary guy. And I think, yeah, this could really be a commentary on buying into one's own hype and how kind of self-destructive that can be, and how when you realize that if everyone's telling you that you're this thing and you're just living this life, at what point do you have to stop and be like, wait, no, I am still me? And even the original double, his brother, has that line about like, he's like, I had trouble going back to being myself after this. And when he goes from being this legendary warlord to essentially a thief and a beggar, but back again, and he can't accept that, and he goes and dies completely pointlessly in that final battle after the final battle is essentially over. So yeah, that all really makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I also thought some of the things were interesting in here too. I thought the use of shadow is something that really jumped out to me. Right at that opening scene, and the way that Kurosawa stages this is very interesting, because his camera is usually a lot more mobile in a lot of his earlier movies, whereas it's a lot more static now. And it's an interesting contrast to someone you'd mentioned you haven't seen any Ozu films, but Ozu was someone who very much just kind of like, he kind of like set the camera in place and he just let the scene play out. Whereas Kurosawa moved things around a little bit more. And I think maybe that's why Kurosawa especially is a little bit more um, maybe interesting, or maybe a little bit more familiar to a lot of Western viewers, at least his earlier stuff, because of that. And I don't know. I haven't re-seen any of those movies, those older movies, in a while. So I'm just going on memory here, but I don't remember the scenes being as static in those earlier movies. And here it feels like it's almost like a play in a lot of ways. I feel like you could actually do this very easily as a stage adaptation.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And yeah, like you said, like this does feel like probably more accessible to Western audiences, especially than something like an Ozu, which I've seen bits and pieces of that, and like him breaking the 180 rule, or just like him showing like a room with like a cat for like a full minute. Like I can see why Western audiences would be taken aback by that, and it just reminds me of something like right now. I haven't got a chance to see it yet, but like Skinamarink is a movie that's kind of making the rounds in the horror community of just being kind of breaking a lot of these film conventions that we are so used to. Whereas this one, yeah, it is kind of playing into a lot of those kind of narrative structures that are familiar to us, a lot of the kind of character arcs that we know. And it is almost, and obviously he is someone who, like you mentioned, that it's a play. I think Kurosawa is someone who is very aware of like structure of kind of plays, and obviously he adapted Shakespeare a number of times, and this does feel very Shakespearean, especially with its kind of just tragic ending that it has for its main character.
Yeah. And the shadow thing is something I didn't quite finish up that thought as I had wanted to, but I want to go back to that. But that struck out to me the very first scene, right? Because I'm looking at that scene, and the Shingen cast this really big, dominant shadow in that scene. And he's like the only one who does, right? None of the other characters, there's almost every time. And then later on, as he starts getting comfortable in the role, the double also starts to cast that same shadow. Although it's a little bit, it's not as distinct, right? It's a little bit, the edges are a little bit softer. And part of that could be the lighting or whatever. Maybe they weren't able to get it as distinct, but I think it does feel like a choice of this idea of like he can't quite match it 100%. And you don't see that kind of lighting on any other characters. It's only on Shingen, only on the double. And you mentioned the brother and how the brother had been the double before. And that shadow separates, is actually kind of like looms over the brother in that scene, right? You've got Shingen here in the middle. You've got the brother to the viewer's left, and then you've got the new double, the bandit, kind of like to the right and off to the corner. And there's this huge shadow between Shingen and his brother, and that really kind of goes into what you were saying about that line where the brother says that it was hard for him to get out of that shadow, break out of that role after he stopped being the double.
Yeah, definitely. And it, the whole thing about like living in their shadow reminds me of something else too that I was thinking about when watching this, and it is just kind of the ambition, and because one character who is definitely figuratively living in the shadow of the original is the son, who is getting, he's getting passed over. He's basically keep bringing up that he is the guardian for his own son, because and how he feels like he is, even in death, his father has slighted him, and he feels like he needs to make his own mark, his own impression, to the detriment of everyone else, because they after he dies, they're like, okay, he tells all his generals and everyone, like, we just need to defend. We cannot attack Kyoto. I wanted to see my banners up when I was alive, but that dream has to die with me, essentially. And then everyone even is like, okay, yeah, we respect this ambition. Even his double is like, I respect this. They all are playing their parts and understanding that while they have their own ambitions, like, they need to worry about themselves. But the endless ambition of the son character just ends up, and you even see, I love that you have that symbol of like the flag in the water, and them being like, oh, it's your father trying to tell us not to go do this battle, and he's just like, no, screw that. I'm gonna, like, it's the screw you to the old man. It's like, I'm gonna be make my own destiny. I'm not gonna live in his shadow. I'm gonna go out and do this. And obviously, it completely fails. It completely falls apart, and he gets to ride off into the sunset or whatever. And just, you're left with like a battlefield of something straight out of a Scorsese movie, which is all of these people gunned down. And that's in the version I saw, that was all that was really in that battle scene, was just lines of people going in and getting gunned down, just one after the other of just these people getting shot down. And it is really, I think the themes that the movie is bringing about, like just kind of like the need to constantly do more and more and more, is something that I think works with the kind of imposter syndrome. It's like, you don't need to constantly live up to this idea of you or someone else that is in place. You can just be content to kind of have protect what you have and not need to constantly reach for the next greatest thing and grow. So I think that all really plays into what we were saying before.
No, absolutely, yeah. And a few things you had said there that I kind of wanted to pick up on, and the whole idea of that kind of like living up to expectations, that whole idea of like, glory through battle and all that. Um, there's a lot of that stuff in Japanese history, right? The whole idea of
Mm-hmm.
the samurai dying in battle and all that kind of stuff. And I feel like one of the most interesting lines to me in this movie was at the beginning when, you know, Shingen is berating the double, and he's like, you're a thief, you're a murderer. How could you possibly be like me? And then the double's just kind of like, well, you know, I'm a thief, I'm a murderer.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how many people have you stolen from in your
Mm-hmm.
conquest, right? How many people have you killed? And not the exact line, but something to that effect. And I thought that was a very good point to make. And there is this kind of idea of, what makes someone a good man, because even though both Shingen and the double have killed, have and have stolen, um Shingen has been on a much wider scale, but history remembers him in a much more positive light. They're not going to remember the lowly criminal um in a positive light. But you see that in, like, I thought the interactions with the grandson were very telling in that, because
Mm-hmm.
the grandson, talks about how, oh, grandpa used to be a lot more distant. He wasn't as fun as he is now. And now he's like, he's much more loving and attentive, is kind of like the effect. So it's this idea of, you know, he can be like Shingen in some ways, but in other ways he can be better than him. And yet he's still saddled with this insecurity as a result of it, even though I feel like what the movie is trying to tell us is that he ultimately is the better man, but he's constantly, these expectations and what Shingen's memory overshadowing him, it makes him feel inadequate.
Yeah, I think that it's absolutely right. I that line at the beginning where he says, he's like, "Yeah, I'm a thief and a murderer, but like, how many people you killed?" It really reminded me of a line that I love from the Mask of Zorro, the '98 one, where they're like, "Oh, they have it's like the former like partner of Antonio Banderas, Zorro's character." And they're like, "Oh, he's just a thief," and he's like, "Yeah, I steal gold, but you steal people's lives. You're the real
Mm-hmm.
thief." Like, there was such a like impactful speech that he gave, and it really reminded me of that. And I think, yeah, that he could honestly be the double, could be such a great, powerful leader, but he thinks he needs to be this other thing. He has such empathy that these people who are raised in this environment um, just frankly don't have. And maybe there's maybe hope. I feel like that the grandson character could have that empathy. He could be, because he seems like he's the one character who is able to be like, no, he's not him. Like, he's the one who is kind, and it's just like, you have to go to war. He actually cares about people and emotions. And yeah, but the double is so concerned with, oh, I have to be this great man that I'm emulating, and he kind of shuts down that empathetic side to himself.
You know what this movie kind of remind me of in a very weird way, and I think everybody is
Hmm.
going to think I'm insane when I say this. But have you ever seen the movie Dave?
No.
No, okay. So Dave was a came out in 1993, directed by Ivan Reitman. It's like this comedy movie where uh, the president is like incapacitated, and they find this
Oh
lookalike,
yeah.
and he kind of takes over the role of him, and he turns out to be much better at the job than the actual president. Right? He's much more
Mhm.
empathetic. He's much more kind. He's much more understanding. And whereas the president and his wife, who's played by Sigourney Weaver in the movie, they were kind of like distant, and they were just kind of like in a marriage for show. Now
Mhm.
she sees this new guy, and at first she doesn't know it's him, but she knows there's something off about him because he's actually much kinder and nicer than her actual husband is. And they end up developing a relationship out of that. And it kind of, in a very weird way, Kagemusha felt a lot like Dave.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and yeah, with the whole doubles and everything, and I was really curious, because I'd seen like the brief synopsis about it being a double that steps into this role, and I was really curious to see, how they would play that out, like this whole kind of Prince and the Pauper trope, and
Mhm.
and it didn't really end up going the way that I thought it would. Like he's honestly, the double is only sporadically in like the first act. He doesn't
Mhm.
really become an important player until the original dies, and and then and then it just becomes, rather than, I thought it was like, oh, it was gonna be a thing like where it's like, okay, like we're gonna have them like switch back and forth, and there's gonna be, a lot of times that is a trope that it's used for comedy, and like obviously I knew this wasn't gonna be a comedy, but I wasn't sure like, oh, like how it's gonna be, but it was really just like asking this question of like, I love the thing where it's like, when the original's gone, what use do you have for a copy, and the way
Mhm.
that all played out was something I had no idea that was going to be the way, the route that they took with this film, with that plot, because it sounds like at first glance like a cheesy kind of plot, like, oh, well, you could, when the guy dies they have to bring in the double, but it's not that at all. It's very obviously serious and very heartfelt, and very emotional. So I did like all of that.
Yeah, there's also this idea here about the kind of like sock puppet leader, right? That
Hmm.
where he's not, he's just the guy who looks like he's in charge, even though he's not really in charge. And now I'm not 100% sure on this, but I feel like this could very easily be seen as an allegory for Japan's part in the war, because you had kind of a similar situation, although scholars have varying opinions about how culpable the emperor was in World War II, but there was definitely a militarist faction that was doing a lot of the leadership. How much Hirohito was actively involved in that is up for debate, but there was that aspect of it. And there is one school of thought that he was just kind of being led along by his advisors. And you could kind, and that was even the kind of like the post-war narrative that the Americans and the new Japanese administration, they used to justify maintaining the imperial system, was, well, the emperor wasn't in control, right? He was there, but it was actually the generals and all that who were in control. And again, there's some truth to that. There's differing ideas about it, but I feel like that might be something that Kurosawa is talking about here as well, where you know this isn't the real Shingen. Shingen is dead, and it's actually his advisors who are leading all this. And there's even this upstart element. There's this rogue element within his faction, led by the son, which is also,
Hmm.
there are similar things happening in Japan. There was an attempted coup the night of the emperor's speech surrendering when they had recorded that
Hmm.
speech. There's a really good movie about it called uh, the Emperor in August, and
Okay.
it's all about that it's really, even though it's not really focused on the Emperor at all, but it is a great movie about that, and it culminates in this attempted coup against the Emperor. And I feel like some of that is here too, and kind of like what these people are, how they're kind of, and this kind of ties back into what I was saying before about how the double mentions that fact that you've killed more people than I ever have, and you steal more than I ever have, and then in all this pursuit of glory and all that, it ends in just battlefields full of bodies and like the ocean full of blood and all that kind of stuff. And I feel like that can also be seen as not only as a commentary on the Sengoku period and the Warring States era, but also a commentary on Japan's role in the war too.
Yeah, no, that's always a thing that I find interesting in films. Like it's even something that even like a film like Vice touched on that. Like Vice was, I don't know if you ever saw
Oh yeah,
the
yeah.
movie. Yeah, so like, and about how basically that film kind of proposes that George W. Bush was kind of just this idiot being manipulated by Dick Cheney, and Dick Cheney, because he was never popular or likable, just needed to become vice president and work for somebody that he could really easily control. And so it's a scene, it's a something that comes up, and I don't know how much of that is true, but it's certainly something that you see it show up from time to time in movies where it's like, yeah, who there's the person who seems to be in power, but then who is really behind it. And it's something that I think people need to pay attention to. Is just like there is always going to be like the person who you think is like the fall guy and the one bad person, but it a lot of times is a lot more systemic than people realize the problem.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Something else I wanted to mention here is the fact that they use guns in the battle scenes, because you don't often see that in samurai epics. I mean, one of the obvious examples of this is Last Samurai, right? Because you have
Mm-hmm.
all the samurai are riding around on horseback and waving swords and everything else, while the modern Japanese military, or at least modern in that movie, are all armed with rifles. And this is a common misconception that people have, is that the samurai always use swords, and they didn't start, and the Japanese didn't start using weapons until after the samurai class ended. That's complete bullshit. The samurai were
Yeah.
using guns back in the 1500s. So I thought I'm glad that they had actually maintained that historical accuracy, and they showed the samurai actually firing off rifles.
Yeah, like I was saying at the beginning, like that was something that really interested me. Is in this kind of time period when that the guns and the swords were overlapping, where it was like, okay, there were still obviously people using swords and archery and things like that. More,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say primitive, but more, kind of older style weapons. But then you have the new weapon, like you have rifles being brought into the equation, and having kind of the old and the new existing and competing with each other at the same time. And like you said, there's not really a lot of stuff that is that like that. The only other thing I can really think of is a movie that I'm a really big fan of, and that this movie I think I can see a lot of the DNA in it, and that's Princess Mononoke. Obviously, that's more
Mm-hmm.
of a fantasy epic than this, but that's something that also uses rifles, but also it has people running around with swords and stuff. So to see that in the same place, and to see, unlike Last Samurai, where they're like, oh, well, this is the way of the future, and the guns are here. It was just like these two things just kind of coexisting at the same time, the past and the present of
Mm-hmm.
Japan, at least in forms of weaponry, kind of out here on the battlefield, and seeing them interact, I thought was very fascinating to me.
Yeah, and because they were using rifles back then, and
Mm-hmm.
like you were talking about, yeah, people were still using swords. I mean, it was very much the same in America and other countries too. Like they were still using but the problem was the guns weren't all that great back then,
Yeah,
right? I
yeah,
remember in I think it was in Glory when he says that a skilled marksman can get off 3 shots a minute, and
yeah.
because you have to load it up and
Mm-hmm.
everything and pour in the gunpowder. And we see that in the scene when the sniper is demonstrating how he did it, and he's like, it takes him forever to load the fucking gun.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they used it for like long range, for sniping, that kind of stuff. But when they got up close, it was using all swords and all that. So yeah, that's very much true. Um, I did like that aspect of it. I did like that they're keeping in with the historical accuracy, as opposed to going with what audiences might expect, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is, and that kind of fuels this misconception that the samurai never used guns. The samurai didn't use guns until, or the Japanese didn't use guns until after until the 1900s, basically, which is completely false. There was a samurai rebellion, like in Last Samurai, but both sides were shooting at each other.
And I also there was like when they were like, oh, the sniper. I was like, oh, they were like it was kind of like, oh wow, there were snipers back then. Like I was kind of like, it's it's one of those things. It's like where you realize that these things did historically coexist. It's like, oh, the samurai existed at the same time as like Abraham Lincoln and like the fact or like the first telegraph or something like they were
Mhm.
all. It's like one of those things where it's like the woolly mammoths that were existing. The last woolly mammoths died out at the same time they were building the pyramids or like stuff like that. Always is very interesting. And when you are seeing, yeah, like this is a nexus point in history where yeah you can still use a sword and like you said it's still better than the primitive gun, but there's certain ways that you can use certain tools. Yeah, it's I felt like this if movie this you set this movie 100 years earlier or 100 years later, it wouldn't have the same effect. It felt like something that was really utilizing its time period in a unique and interesting way.
I've got an interesting tangent about that. Several years
Mm-hmm.
ago, I was invited to participate in an adventure anthology, and it was a Sinbad anthology. And so, time of Sinbad is like what, like 1200s, 1300s, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things they had done is, because Sinbad is a public domain character, anyone can use him, but they had established this kind of like crew of adventurers to go along with him, and they were all from like different parts of the world. You had like a Viking guy in there, you had like a French guy in there, and they had a Japanese character in there who was they described her as being a samurai and who was using like
Mm-hmm.
a katana sword, and I'm just like, wait a minute, like this character in this time period exists like a few centuries before the samurai even existed.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like, it's kind of like doing a western where the guy's walking around with the Tommy gun.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I always think that stuff is really interesting. Like, one that it's not a great movie, but a movie that I think does a really good job of making you realize, oh, these things did exist at the same time. Was the 13th Warrior, where it's like, oh yeah, you have this Arabian warrior who goes and teams up with the Vikings, and it's kind of like a Viking revenge story, but with a Arabian Nights like tinge to it. And when you have those kind of crossovers, I think it's interesting. And this also remind me of something in this movie. It's barely in the movie, but it's very briefly touched on. They like mention some crucifixion, and you see the guy speaking in Latin doing that prayer. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess like the Christian missionaries coming to Japan would have been around that time. So it's not something I'm super knowledgeable about, but one of my favorite films ever is Silence, and that is a big part of Silence. So I kind of was like, oh, that's really cool and interesting to just kind of those little tent poles that are like, yeah, this was happening at this time.
Mm-hmm. Also, I thought that dream sequence was pretty interesting. What did you think of the dream sequence?
I thought that was amazing and incredible, and it obviously did such a good job of reinforcing those themes of him feeling like he was his imposter syndrome and feeling like he was being chased around by the ghost of the original, and just kind of like seeing all this death and all these things that he was responsible for. I really liked all that. And then, like I was saying earlier, visually, just absolutely incredible because obviously he messes around with color a lot in this movie. But this was like, he's like, okay, I can really, because this is a dream, I can just make this look insane. Like, it felt
Mm-hmm.
like when we were kids, it was like the big thing in the 90s was like those little sands that you would put in this tube and they would be like a layered. I don't know if you remember that, but like that's
Yeah,
what it
yeah,
felt
I
like.
do,
He
I
was
do.
just, yeah, exactly. Like he was walking around this kind of like pixel art, just like vividly colored, like it's almost neon colored. And just to see that trippiness and to see him kind of just like walking through that and being pursued by it gave a literal definition or a little representation of his imposter syndrome in a pretty creative way, I thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought so too, and I thought just that whole idea of like him, trying to it's a perfect illustration of him trying to fit into that mold, trying to become this great warrior that he's really
Hmm.
not, and also just like his himself constantly telling him that this is not who he is. What about the ending? How'd you land on the ending of the movie?
I think the ending was probably like the last 20 or so minutes, like after he gets exposed. I thought was some of the most interesting stuff. I was like, at first I was pretty on the fence about it. I felt like, wow, this is a real bummer of an ending. Like I thought maybe he would go off and just kind of just fade into the unknown or something. And that was going to be his tragic ending, or like he would get to say some last thing to the grandson at the funeral. But then when he just died so pointlessly, at first I was like, wow, this is really depressing. But then I was like, you know what, that checks out with everything that's happened in the film. It checks out with him buying into his own thing that he's going to, and I mean, I'm sure that he knows he's going to die there, but I think by then he believes that this kind of quote unquote noble death for these people who honestly, like, they were like throwing rocks at him, like, and he's still
Mm-hmm.
willing to die for this cause that is already lost, was so tragic and Shakespearean. And that like end credits scene where he's, you see him and he goes for the flag and he just kind of floats away and dies. uh I thought that was all just, it felt, it was a bummer of an ending, and it's probably because of the ending, not a film, and the length. It's not a film that I'm going to revisit anytime soon, but it's
Mm-hmm.
something that definitely stuck with me.
So yeah, I feel like I think I'd probably disagree about him knowing that he's going to die, because the way they show his eyes, like with the red in them and everything, I feel like it feels like he's they're trying to imply that he's kind of gone crazy from this obsession with being Shingen. And so now I think he really has not really bought into his own hype, but bought into the hype of Shingen, of that idea of like this great warrior. And he feels like he can ride in and save the day. And I think that's and then ultimately he gets killed. So I don't think he went in knowing he was going to die. I think he just really so firmly believed this that he just got brainwashed by
It's like the same thing as him
this
being on
myth.
the horse.
I'm sorry, say it again.
I was gonna say, you think it's like the same thing as him believing he could ride the horse, but to like a
I
greater
think so.
extent? Okay,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah, I
I
think
see
so.
that.
I think so. I think that scene with the horse is kind of a precursor to this, right? Because
Hmm.
it shows it, right. It's this idea of like, oh yeah, because because the entire time, right, he's just kind of like going along with everything. But then when he's asked to do something and he does it, and he just, by sheer fucking happenstance, he happens to hit on the right idea, and then
Hmm.
he just buys into that, right?
Hmm.
And I think I mean, and all of that had that. Everyone has that idea of false confidence, right? Anything you do it right one time, you're like, oh, I'm amazing now. I don't have to worry about it. And the next
Yeah.
time you do it, you completely fuck it up. And I think that's really kind of what's happening here. Um, and it could also be seen as also tying into that whole idea about commenting on directing and filmmaking too, because we see that all the time, right? A director makes an amazing movie and then gets all this praise heaped on them. And then there's like all this anticipation and excitement. Oh, what's his next movie? What's his next movie? The next movie comes out and it's just like, what?
Yeah, no, I hear you on that one. Yeah, it definitely falls into that. Yeah, just we tend to praise these directors and they feel like they could, take on an army by themselves, metaphorically speaking, and they just kind of go out and make something. You're like, what was that, And so yeah, and it's interesting. Yeah, talking again, like you said, about the different kind of ways that Japan and America views directors, and a lot of Japanese directors are these working directors. They're
Mm-hmm.
more kind of just like guns for hire than a lot of these American directors who are kind of seen as these visionary guys. And Kurosawa, I think, is one of the people who is seen as a visionary person, and it is a lot of because of a lot of people like the people like you mentioned who swooped in and kind of got Fox to give the last 20th Century Fox to swoop in and kind of give the money to this movie to finish it, and that was Coppola and George Lucas, who, yeah, I think that is somebody. George Lucas is another one of these guys, and Coppola is another one of these
Mm-hmm.
guys who were like these larger than life figures. They made like The Godfather, like Coppola made The Godfather, and then after that he made Apocalypse Now, and then he made a few movies that were not the best. Like he made a few movies that just kind of came out and flopped, and critics didn't like them, audience didn't like him, and he didn't hasn't made anything for like 20 years. I know now he's working on his long gestating sci-fi megalopolis movie, and then George Lucas has made like 6 movies ever. He made obviously his Star
Mm-hmm.
Wars movies, and then he made the prequels, and people are starting to come back around on them, but at the time they were definitely very negatively received. And I think that a big part of it is because they get more and more and more creative control and think they can kind of just do everything themselves instead of, like you were saying, like he's charging alone by himself, when, like we were saying, movies are collaborative processes. You
Hmm.
need to have all of these people in the trenches, so to speak, with you. Like, you have to go in with a good cinematographer, a great actors who understand you, all of this other stuff. And the interesting thing in looking up this up, like, apparently they had a different actor who was playing the main character for like a day, and him and Kurosawa
Hmm.
just butted heads, so he got fired. So that's really interesting, because you really have to be in line with everyone, and you can't just do it all yourself.
Right. Yeah. In fact, that's a good thing. And I think Kurosawa himself learned that lesson the hard way because he
Mm.
so yeah, it was Shintaro Katsu was the original actor. And Katsu had gotten angry. He had gotten Kurosawa angry because he arrived with his own camera crew to record Kurosawa's filmmaking methods, and and it's not quite clear if Katsu was fired or if he left on his own. But whatever the place, then they brought in Tatsuya Nakadai to play him, and he had worked with Kurosawa a number of times before, um, and and yeah, when Kurosawa, because he had done that, right? He had gone through that whole experience where he's like, I'm too good for the Japanese film industry. So I'm going to leave and I'm going to go to America. And then he starts working on Tora, Tora, Tora. And I think that's when he really realized that the crew you're working with, the producers you're working with are really important, because he had an unfamiliar crew he was working with. He had producers that didn't understand the way he worked or didn't want to understand the way he worked. And, there are questions there about how much of that is just, Kurosawa being set in his ways, how much of that is, racism, how much of that is any of those other things that go in. But the what he learned was, what, I do need a crew the crew is important, right? The people you work with are very important to in order to put out a good product. Because otherwise, if you buy too much into your own hype, and I think, we mentioned Chris Nolan, but I think also M. Night Shyamalan is one example, right? He
Mm-hmm.
made, he had this string of great, well-received movies like, The Sixth Sense and Unbreakable, and then he starts making stuff like Lady in the Water and The Village, and it's just like, and then the whole thing becomes, what's the twist ending? And he feels like,
Mm-hmm.
and he just kind of hinges everything on that twist ending, and then everybody stops caring after that point.
Yeah, and I think bringing up M. Night Shyamalan is like really smart, and it is because he is like some guy who, like, he had this string of things, and he was like literally anointed as the next Spielberg on like
Mm-hmm.
magazine covers and stuff, and and then starting with The Village, I think you can really start to see the cracks start to form, and they just give him more and more money, and he just makes bigger and bigger just disappointments and bombs, to the point where you get to The Last Airbender, which is just like, what even, that movie was like,
Mm-hmm.
you have great source material and just completely screw everything up, and there's a million reasons for that. And then after that, his more recent career, he starts independently funding himself. He starts making things that he's like, okay, I am going to do something on a more modest budget. I'm going to do something that are much more personal stories, like, and things that I don't expect to be these huge genre defining things. He's no longer trying to be the next Spielberg. He's just trying to tell more personal, intimate, kind of weirder stories. And I think his last 5 or 6 movies that have all been self-funded have all been much greater successes. Even the ones like I did Knock at the Cabin, which just came out over here, um, was a very solid, if not remarkable, horror movie, horror kind of thriller made for a modest budget. And because it had a modest budget, it didn't need to break all these box office records. It just did all right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that is happening. Like, we are starting to see with the kind of re-rise of like just franchises being the big driving thing, all these big blockbuster, the MCU films or the Mission Impossible movies, Fast and Furious, all of those are becoming a lot bigger than like the 90s and the early 2000s, which were a lot more of like, oh, here's Michael Bay's next movie or whatever. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that Shyamalan is ahead of the curve. Then he's like, you know what? I'm going to be able to still make my vision, but for a more affordable budget. And I think that maybe a lot of these other guys who are still trying to cling to, like, no, I'm still the guy, I'm still the director with the vision, and I'm just going to make my $100 million movie. and then it's going to fail at the box office unless you're
Mhm.
James Cameron. A lot of people are, especially in these kind of post or current, like whatever mid-pandemic times, however you want to classify it.
Right.
So he's someone who is like realizing that the times are changing when it comes to this stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah. And sometimes you have that situation where what's that very famous one? The Western epic where the
Once Upon a Time in the West.
right, and sometimes you have a situation like Heaven's Gate, right? Michael Cimino does the Deer Hunter, it gets all this acclaim, and then he gets all this cred, and then because of that, then it becomes like the most famous flop of all time with Heaven's Gate.
Mhm. Yeah, or like even something contemporary. I haven't gotten a chance to see it yet, but Babylon is made by Damien Chazelle, who I am a huge fan of. I love his first three films. But yeah, it's been a huge flop, and it's definitely got its defenders. And I do want to get a chance to see when I get a chance. But a lot of people are not enjoying it. It was expected to be this big Oscar contender and a big movie that was going to make all this money, and it's not. It's not being. And I think that they like studios are just kind of learning that you can't just throw 100, $200 million at a director and just be like, just make whatever insane idea you have with no oversight or no. Not
Mhm.
that I'm saying studio interference is a good thing, but I think there is a balance where there are other creators and other input that you have to listen to.
No, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a degree of where you want some sort of interference. I mean, I think,
Hmm.
and taking this to novel territory, you look at someone like Anne Rice, who
Hmm.
now she got so famous and so popular that she was able to kind of set her own terms with her publishing contract. So, and one of those terms is she doesn't want an editor looking over her shoulder. And so then now she'll have proofreaders and all that kind of stuff, but she won't have anyone going through it like saying like, this doesn't make sense in the story like this. And then when her first book came out like that, people started complaining about it. And then she was responding directly to the complaints and talking about how and she was defending her everything she had done. And she was, saying like, I don't need an editor. I don't. And that's a perfect example of someone who is, buying so much into their own hype. And I think yeah, that's a definite risk when you're in this kind of creative medium. And I think also too, it's a lesson too about the way people respond to films. I think this is one of the good things when you have that kind of workman like quality of a lot of directors. Because again, going back to Takashi Miike makes a flop. It doesn't ruin his career because he's already on his other project. He's already got two other movies in the can while he's developing a third one. So if one movie flops, it doesn't matter. There's another one coming and then another one. There's not so much invested in this
Hmm.
idea of like this big success piece. And as a result, there's a lot less pressure too.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's he's a producer, but I think it's someone who has the same model, which is Jason Blum, and he's got his Blumhouse films, and he's like, okay, I'm just going to do all these different films. A lot of them are going to be for a smaller budget, so if a bunch of them don't hit, then that's fine. Nope
Mm-hmm.
is probably going to be a big success. Like he makes a bunch of money from Nope, or even something like Smile, which was a cup. I think maybe like $1 or $2 million budget, and then it just ends up blowing up and being like making $100 million at the box office. It's like okay, cool. These other 5 films failed, but this one made 100 times its budget, so it doesn't matter that these ones failed. And I think
Right.
like a lot of the you are seeing a lot of these smaller kind of quote unquote independent studios, stuff like Blumhouse and A24 are able to really, and Neon are able to survive off of that model. And I think it's a really good one. And then, you have the big studios. I think it's something I've talked about before on some other podcasts. Unfortunately, with that, some of the mid-budget movies, like the movies that are made between 40 and $80 million, are starting
Mm-hmm.
to disappear because, they're not too big to fail, and they're also not small enough that you don't have to worry about them, and the gap is widening between movies because of that. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't really know what to do about that, but I do like that we are still able to get smaller independent films because the risk is mitigated by them just kind of like having this budget like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Is there any final things you wanted to mention about Kagemusha?
The only thing I was thinking is there was one moment that I'm curious to get your opinion on that didn't really work for me, and that was when the double is kind of like, you know what, please let me let me do this thing, because up till then he's very, very resilient, and it feels like he switches on a dime a little bit, that he wants to, and I get why, from a character standpoint, but it did feel abrupt. It felt like we just need to be at this point now. And maybe there was more in the extended edition, but it felt like very abrupt when he saw, after him going from seeing the people spying on the funeral to being like, no, please let me do this, after he was flat out refusing a scene earlier.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I didn't really clock that myself, but I'm not sure if I'm not sure if it played out in a more believable way, but I felt like, a lot of it was, I did feel like the character work wasn't as strong in this as in Kurosawa's other movies. So I think that might have been just the overriding thing that was running through my mind in it.
Yeah, it definitely was. It felt like a more plot-driven movie and a more thematic-driven movie than a character study, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that their personal themes with the character, and the things that he's going through with all the imposter syndrome and stuff like that. But I don't think he's himself is like, particularly noteworthy or interesting.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think I definitely agree with that. I don't know. I think my final thing is it's an interesting movie, and I think we definitely found some interesting things to talk about. I think Kurosawa was saying some pretty cool things about in this movie, but ultimately, it's probably not a movie I'm going to revisit again. Like it's 3 hours long, and I felt those 3 hours. So it was a little bit tough for me to get through. Like I'll watch Seven Samurai again. I'll watch Seven Samurai numerous times again, and because that is it again. It's 3 hours, but it's a brisk 3 hours, and a lot of his other movies where I feel like the character work is much stronger, like in Yojimbo or even in like Throne of Blood too, which also has that kind of like Shakespearean feel to it. And Kurosawa himself, he said that this was kind of like his test run for Ran. So I feel like there's a lot of him trying to just kind of figure things out, trying to figure out how he's, especially coming after, this decade of uncertainty with, the Tora debacle. And I think he's just kind of like trying to regain his footing in a sense in this movie. And now I haven't seen Ran, but from what I understand, it is like one of his greatest movies. So I think that definitely seems to have worked in his favor.
Yeah, I would be really, really interested to check out Ran. I think, especially after seeing the way he used color in this, I would love to see more of his color films. And I think that black and white can be really compelling and interesting. Like I think that, for example, the black and white cut of Nightmare Alley is far superior to the color cut. And there's a lot of, older films that are shot in black and white, stuff like Sunrise or even something like The Apartment that uses that really well. But it seems like, they gave him this extra thing to work with, and he just was like, I'm going to just take this. It's like James Cameron getting to work in 3D. It's like, I have this whole other tool, and I'm going to utilize it to its absolute fullest.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Derek, I think that's all we have to say about this. So why don't you tell people where they can find your stuff?
Yeah, thank you. Like I said, I'm co-host of the Underrated podcast, which you can find on any of the podcast apps. However you're listening to this, Underrated's also on that. So you can just look up Underrated or look up Undercast Company, because sometimes if you do Google search for Underrated podcast, it just gives you like a bunch of lists from whatever, just talking about other podcasts that are underrated. So look up Undercast Company on all the social media sites, and that's us there, or just give us a listen, Underrated, anywhere.
Okay, great. Derek, thanks so much for coming on and dipping your toe into a little bit more of Japanese film with us.
Thank you. Yeah, I just will say, I had a really good time, and it's something that I've really wanted to explore more of, and I'm glad I got this opportunity to do it here.
Okay, well, we got a bunch more recommendations on the website, so japanonfilm.com if anyone else is also looking out for that. And then Japan on Film is us on Instagram and Twitter and all those places, and we are now part of the We Made This Network, so you check them out at wemadethisnetwork.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the We Made This podcast network. Visit japanonfilm.com for show notes, episodes, merchandise, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at JapanOnFilm. If you'd like to help support the show, you can donate at JapanOnFilm.com, WeMadeThisNetwork.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find links with information about each guest and join the discussion on the We Made This Discord in the show notes of each episode. And now, listen to hear what's coming up next on the We Made This Network.
Are you a fan of the Marvel Universe?
Can you tell your Kang from your Doctor Doom?
Well, if so, boy, do we have a podcast for you.
Podcast 616 is the We Made This Network's long-running Marvel podcast, and it's under new management.
We're your hosts, Ashley Thomas
and Hugh McStay.
And together, we are going to lead you every step of the way through the Marvel Cinematic Universe's upcoming multiverse saga.
Everything from She-Hulk to Avengers Secret Wars will be covered on the podcast in the kind of detail that would make a Wikipedia article blush.
We're going to have some detours into the wider Marvel world where we'll look at non-MCU projects dating all the way back to Marvel's origins in the groovy, funky 60s, and all the way up to the birth of the greatest franchise in cinema history.
And we'll be joined on our adventure by a roll call of guests so impressively knowledgeable that they'll make the Avengers themselves look clueless by comparison.
So if you like your opinions sharper than Wolverine's claws,
or takes hotter than the Human Torch's underpants,
then get Podcast 616 in your ears as a matter of urgency.
You'll love it 3000.
Podcast 616.
Disassemble.